Nathan Carroll, the Executive Director of the Littleton Area Chamber of Commerce. Again, thanks for joining us today. We're pleased to welcome Richard Lavers, our Deputy Commissioner of New Hampshire Department of Employment Security. We're here for a employment security update along with a question and answer period. The webinar is also presented in partnership with the New Hampshire Association of Chamber of Commerce Executives, for which I serve as the Vice Chair, and Wendy Hunt, who's actually joining us today visually, is our chair as well. A few housekeeping items. You will remain muted for the duration of the presentation. I can unmute if needed, but I would like for any questions to be directed to Megan Wright. She is our administrative assistant, and she's going to be running the chat. So if you've got any questions as Deputy Commissioner is presenting, please present those in the chat, and she will make sure we know exactly what those questions are at the end. There's a number of questions that have been submitted in advance as well. We'll get to those, of course, first. And Rich, I guess it's all you now, my friend. Thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk to a big group. Real quick, it's nice to talk with all of you. I have Littleton area roots, where my father grew up in Dalton, mother grew up in Lancaster. If folks familiar with Lancaster, the old Lancaster machine shop, that was my grandfather's business. He closed that down, I think it was back in the 90s, but that was my grandfather. So nice to talk with all of you. I thought I could give you a little bit of a lay of the land in terms of the numbers that we've been seeing. To describe it as historic or unprecedented really does not do it justice at all. Maybe for the first week or two of what we saw, but certainly not what we've seen over this prolonged period. So I can give you a sense of what we've seen, what the trust fund looks like right now, and then I just figure we might as well get right into questions so we can answer as many of those as possible. What we have seen so far, so starting on March 17th, when the governor expanded eligibility for all of the COVID-19 related job separations and self-employed, we have paid out over $231 million during that time frame. Just to put that into perspective, in our prior years since the Great Recession, we have been paying out approximately in the $40 to $45 million range per year. And we have been receiving in that same $45 to $50 million range per year in employer taxes to support the trust fund. So that level of payment in a little over a month's time is just not anything anyone could have anticipated. We've had 145,000 new claims during that time period. The breakdown for all of those, going back to week ending 3/21, we got 28,000 in that first week. The week prior to that, we had just under 600. So talk about a spike without any real warning for the magnitude of what was about to hit. That following week, we got 29,000. Then we spiked to 39,000. Then we fell off to 22,000. Then to 17,000 in the week ending April 18th. And then the week ending April 25th will get released by U.S. Department of Labor tomorrow, but it will be less than what we saw the prior week. So that's 3 weeks of decline. But where I was at 600 new claims a week, and now if I'm going to be in the 15,000 range in sound relieved, if you had asked me that back on, say, March 16th, I would have thought you were crazy, that I would be happy about 15,000 new claims in a single week. What we have been doing in terms of our efforts to ramp up claim processing, we were slammed, like I just highlighted for you, we were slammed just like every other surrounding state. Right now, we are at about a 90% payment rate. So that means not every single new claim turns into a payable claim. Not every new claim turns into a weekly claim. So of the active weekly claims that are being filed, we are paying 90% of those right now, which I think is a pretty impressive number considering the volume that we've seen. We have received, let's see, over 200,000 calls on the new hotline that we set up. That's mostly staffed with men and women from the New Hampshire National Guard at 3 sites across Concord. They're handling, we had been peaking out at about 10,000 calls a day. That's fallen off a little bit. A lot of money flowing out the door will reduce call volume. And so we're still getting around 8,000 calls a day. That payment rate at 90% and those 10% of people that are active claim filers that are not being paid, some of them are eligible, but some of them aren't. And the one common characteristic of each and every one of those claims is that pursuant to federal rules, federal law, and state law, we have a process that we have to go through to review the underlying characteristics of each claim to make sure those individuals are eligible. It gets lost on a lot of people right now that the unemployment system is still an eligibility-based program. We are not an entitlement program. This is not like the stimulus checks that come from the federal government. You still need to have been working. You still, in most instances, you still need to have been earning wages in order to qualify for benefits, even under the expanded eligibility with the COVID-19 type of scenarios. So we spend a lot of time reinforcing that with people. We're going to try to be doing a better job of that with some changes to our website that we're going to be launching tomorrow. But we're still an eligibility-based program. We still, pursuant to federal law, have to thoroughly review a claim before turning it into a payable claim. If we weren't doing that, if we were paying any differently than we are right now, we would be out of compliance with federal requirements, which would threaten the very existence of the state's unemployment program. Our grant funding would be jeopardized, and New Hampshire businesses would no longer receive their 90% credit against their FUTA payments. So right now, New Hampshire business gets that 90% credit, which totals about $200 million a year in savings statewide that you're not paying to the federal government. The reason you get that is because you're in good standing, right? You have paid your tax obligations for unemployment purposes, but it's also because New Hampshire Employment Security is in good standing with the feds. So we have, if we were to alter our payment processing to pay faster, as some have suggested we need to do, that would put all of that in jeopardy. And so it's a very slippery slope that we need to caution people against, despite the overwhelming pressure with the situations that people find themselves in to try to pay faster. We received a report from the U.S. Department of Labor Inspector General last week, a very aggressive report. Pretty much it was intended to give people like me to make sure I didn't sleep that night. It was to give us pause, to remind us that you can't just simply pay despite your the overwhelming pressure to do so because of the unfortunate circumstances that a lot of people find themselves in. They were pretty much telling states that, hey, we're watching, we're going to come knocking on your door, make sure you're paying correctly and only those that are eligible and the correct amounts. They have really come down hard on states that basically turned off all of their eligibility requirements from prior disasters like Texas and Louisiana following Hurricanes Rita and Katrina. And those states, their unemployment programs have paid a price. The employers in those states have paid a significant price because of those agencies failing to follow federal requirements. So we're not going to make the same mistake here, but you're going to continue to see the pressure from some for us to do that, and we're going to continue to push back. On the trust fund, so we started going into this crisis, New Hampshire had a solvent trust fund that was determined solvent, not by New Hampshire, but independently determined by the U.S. Department of Labor. They had done their most recent solvency analysis of state trust funds in February. New Hampshire was one of 31 states and territories that was considered to have a solvent trust fund. So we started this with about $300 million. There were 20 some odd states and territories that did not start solvent. you already have some states that are borrowing from the federal government in order to continue to pay benefits. I haven't seen this officially reported, but I was told that the state of New York has already borrowed $4 billion in order to pay benefits in their state. So we are fortunate that we started this with a healthy trust fund. Right now, in looking at trying to break down the types of payments that have gone out, roughly 78.4 million of that total 231 million, that 78 million has hit our trust fund. And 35 of that will be reimbursed by the feds because those benefits were paid out under the federal program, and the other 43 million were paid out under the state program. So that leaves us right now at about $275 million with what we've received in tax payments, and taking into consideration what has gone out. The CARES Act did put states in a tough spot where the way it is right now, I don't see how any state will not run out of money in their trust fund. And the reason for that is that they put a requirement in the federal unemployment program that they borrowed from prior disaster programs that requires states before you determine someone eligible under federal UI, you have to first determine whether or not they have state UI eligibility. And for a lot of the new eligibility scenarios, so someone that's taking care of a dependent because school and daycare is closed, or someone caring for a family member, or someone sick with COVID or symptoms of COVID, all of those types of scenarios, those are eligible under the federal program because you don't have state UI eligibility for those types of what would be viewed as a voluntary quit. However, regular business closures, so a business that simply closed clearly because of COVID-19, but it's still viewed by the federal government as a temporary business shutdown, those right now, those benefits that result from that are being required to be borne by the states and not the federal government. Unless something is done about that, every single state will bankrupt their unemployment trust funds. New Hampshire, we're paying out right now, we have a little over $20 million going out of the fund per week. I don't see that easing off anytime soon, particularly because of the $600 payment that everyone is adding on to their weekly benefit. And a lot of groups, particularly retail, hospitality, and restaurants, what they're receiving now from unemployment because of that federal $600 exceeds what they were earning while employed. That's not a healthy dynamic. It's not a long-term sustainable dynamic. And right now, with the $600 going all the way to the end of July, it is going to be difficult for you all to convince people to come back to work. We can get into what review we are allowed to go through once you do call someone back. I anticipate there's probably a lot of questions around that. But it's going to be difficult to get people to come off of the enhanced UI. And in a lot of cases, they're earning over $1,000 a week on UI, and unemployment is all of a sudden a competitor of employment, which is kind of like, the tail wagging the dog here. And unemployment exists to support employment. It is not supposed to be vice versa like we have right now. I do have some ideas for how businesses can kind of combat that disincentive to come back to work right now. Some of you might be familiar with the department's work share program. That's a program that has been around since it was originally launched by Governor Lynch. It's a program where an employer can, in ordinary times, it exists for you to avoid making layoffs. But in this time, you can use it to incentivize people to come back. So it allows you to reduce units of no less than 2 employees, reduce their hours by 10% to 50%. And that then allows them to have eligibility for that same percentage of their regular weekly unemployment benefit. So if you had someone that you decided you were going to bring back a unit at a 50% reduction, and that person, say, had earned over $41,500 in their last 4-quarter period, they would be getting their ordinary unemployment benefit would be $427. So with that 50% reduction, they would get 50% of that benefit. Then they also get the $600, okay, plus the wages that you're paying them. So I've talked with a lot of employers recently and really trying to get them to understand that if you can get into a work share program, I think that's how you're going to incentivize people to want to come back and not to continue to collect unemployment, at least through July. As long as that 600 isn't reauthorized, I think then it takes care of itself, right? Then the unemployment benefits go back to that 50, 60% wage replacement rate that we had before, and people will come back to work at that point. We've updated all of our work share information on our website. When you go to NHES.nh.gov, there's a big green button that says work share. If you click on that, it brings you to all of our work share information, and then it provides the contact information for the folks that work out of our Conway office that actually are administering our work share program right now. I think that folks trying to bring people back, work share is really the way to go. And it saves the New Hampshire Trust Fund too. So all of the benefits paid are 100% federally reimbursed. So that's huge from a trust fund perspective. It'll help you get those people to come back. Regarding callbacks, just anticipating that as a question. So we were waiting for guidance from the feds on a series of questions that states had submitted. The feds released some responses on Monday night. And one of those was, if someone refuses to come back to work, do they still qualify for federal unemployment? So it's someone that would have previously certified as being out of work because to take care of a child or a family member, or they had COVID or symptoms of COVID, or work was closed because of COVID. So the guidance that came back was that the person can't refuse to come back just simply to continue to collect UI. However, and every time that you read an answer from USDOL and it has an unless or a however, that's when you know whatever you've read prior to that, you might as well just have skipped over. If the person continues to certify, and this is self-certification, no documentation required per the feds, if they self-certify as to continuing to be unavailable for a CARES Act reason, so one of those COVID reasons, they can refuse your job offer and they can continue to collect UI. So we are enhancing our weekly certification process in light of the new guidance. So when an individual goes in to file that weekly claim, most of them do it on Sunday. That's the first day they can do that. They go in and they have to certify that they are currently unable or unavailable to work because, and we have a series of COVID-19 related scenarios that they have to select from. So those scenarios are all of the scenarios that were outlined in the CARES Act. So again, you have COVID or symptoms of COVID. You've been directed by a medical provider to self-quarantine. You have, you're caring for a child with a school or daycare that's closed. You're caring for a family member. Your business is closed because of COVID. You can't reach your place of employment because of an imposed quarantine. Or you had, and this is the only example of someone that could not have been working and somehow qualify, you had an offer of employment that was retracted because of COVID. So if you certify to any of those, you continue to meet eligibility for UI. And so you would continue that despite having rejected the offer of employment to come back to work. Now, you have to have one of those scenarios. You can't, presumably, I would hope that someone that doesn't have a dependent is also going to decide to select that item and say, yep, I have a child that I'm the primary caregiver for. But benefits at that level can provide quite an incentive. What we are limited to do right now is it is self-certification, because that is what was in the CARES Act. We can ask someone that is, if someone indicates that they are simply self-quarantining out of concern for COVID, that's not a valid reason for them to continue to qualify for UI. If they are self-quarantining at the direction of a government official, a healthcare official, or their employer, and they self-certify to that, then they would continue to be eligible. So again, it's self-certification. They have to certify to that reason every week. But obviously you can tell by that description that it does allow an opportunity, particularly with the $600 UI enhanced payment, that for someone to elect not to come back despite your offer. So Nathan, I think we could, I can jump into some other questions now so we can try to get through as much of that as possible.
Great, sure. So we did receive a number of questions in advance. And again, if you want to submit a question to us to go through after the ones that we've received in advance, you can submit it to Megan, who's our chamber administrative assistant. She's administering the chat, so you can change your chat option from everyone to Megan, and we'll check in with her at the end of the pre-submitted questions and make sure that we get to those as well. The first question was a question that said, I've received what I gathered was a PPP loan. With this, I can reopen my business for 1 month. Can my employees reapply for UI afterwards?
Yes. So in that scenario, if the employees were to come back and work during that month, they could then reopen their unemployment claim if they were then again temporarily laid off, furloughed, but were unemployed following that. Yes. I believe there's some, in talking with the SBA, they're expecting some additional guidance from the feds around the PPP loans. There's nothing that's been put out there yet that I have seen any reason to think that there would be a restriction within the loan forgiveness or qualifying for loan forgiveness of the PPP loan by utilizing Workshare. I haven't seen anything that would cause Workshare not to be allowed, but I do understand that they're still waiting for further guidance. But when you look at the goals of the Workshare, which is to incentivize people to work, the goals of PPP is to allow employers to be able to bring people back to work. I think their purposes line up very well. So I don't see why there would be any restriction on use of where you have to put 75% of that PPP loan to payroll, that as long as you properly structured a Workshare plan with the appropriate reductions on either a portion of your workforce or all of them, then I don't see any reason that you couldn't do Workshare. But I know in talking with some people, they want to wait to see what that guidance looks like that's coming out from the feds, that some people have said they expect it on Friday, but I'm not sure of that because it's outside of the employment security world.
Great, thank you. An additional question, I've been furloughed as a 40-hour plus weekly independent contractor. I have one W-2 earning for $95 only. I heard that might disqualify me.
Okay, so in that scenario, because we are required to look at state eligibility first, and self-employment is eligible under the federal program, we'd first look at those W-2 earnings during the base period. There you said, Nathan, it was only $95 of W-2 earnings. So that would actually not provide eligibility under state UI because those would be insufficient earnings. You need to have at least $1,400 in 2 separate quarters in your base period in order to qualify for state UI. So they would not be state UI eligible. So then we would look at their self-employment earnings from 2019 under the federal program. If they are unable to provide either a tax return or 1099s from 2019, and we are limited to 2019 by the CARES Act. If they are unable to document and verify those earnings, they get put in at right now at $167 a week, which is the federal minimum payment. That also provides eligibility for the 600, so it would be $767 a week. If they haven't filed yet and they file subsequently, they could then submit their 2019 tax return, and if it shows earnings more than the amount that would get you the $167 a week, that the $167 a week you get if you had $15,500 in earnings during 2019. So if they had more than $15,500 and they have their tax return or 1099, then it would be in their interest to submit that to Employment Security so that we could increase their weekly benefit amount to that upper level.
Great. Okay, thank you. This one is, and this may have been covered a little bit in what you explained about the new qualifiers that you have for the weekly filing for folks. But the question was, my business is exempt from closure, but NHES is approving employees for UI who have not been instructed to stay home and are now making more money than those working.
Yeah, so that would fall into that group that you have that incentive to collect UI because those are the $600, and as long as they're certifying to us that they meet one of those COVID-related eligibility scenarios, then they would continue to be able to collect. Obviously, if they had indicated as to being in self-quarantine at the instruction of their employer, and the employer is telling us that's not the case, then we would obviously be reviewing those, because that would eliminate that particular area of eligibility. But in all the other types of eligibility, they could self-certify that they're quarantining at the instruction of either a government official or a healthcare provider, and they would still be eligible.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. Is there an income limit for self-employed sole proprietors in order to collect unemployment if you've been affected by the coronavirus situation? You may have just touched on that, but go ahead.
So there's no income limit, but the maximum weekly benefit amount before you add on the 600 is $427 per week. So that's the maximum benefit in New Hampshire. If you earn $41,500 or more, you qualify for $427. So that 41.5 person has the same benefit as the person that's making $100,000. So that's the maximum weekly benefit amount, and then you add the $600 onto that.
I think what they may have meant is there a low end minimum, which you sort of mentioned before in that $1,400 amount, if you don't mind clarifying that again.
Yeah, so for a regular W-2 employment, first we look to see, because we have to look at state eligibility first, and I understand that is incredibly confusing, and it's difficult to implement as well. But if a person has sufficient earnings in regular W-2 employment of at least $1,400 in 2 separate quarters during that 4-quarter base period, then they would have state UI eligibility, okay? If they don't have those W-2 earnings and it's just self-employment and all self-employment, they wouldn't have state eligibility. They would go in the federal program and they'd go in at the minimum of $167 a week unless they can document and verify earnings above $15,500 in 2019, then they could qualify for a higher benefit. One scenario under that is if you have someone, you could have someone that was working part-time W-2 and full-time self-employment went away because of COVID. They're still working their part-time. That person that files, we would have to look at the W-2 earnings first. They would have state eligibility. And because of that, we wouldn't be able to take into consideration their self-employment earnings. That's really frustrated a lot of people. I've tried to explain it to them. It's the requirements under the federal program. We don't have any discretion there, and that's how it's required to work. But it has, a lot of people have been quite upset by that.
Thanks. Will unemployment tax rates increase for employers as the UI trust fund is depleted?
Yes, they will. Employers, so as folks know, you had your maximum reduction for all of 2019 and the first quarter of 2020. So you had that full 1.5% reduction. It's referred to as a fund balance reduction, or an FBR. And those are controlled by the balances in the trust fund. So you get a 0.5 point reduction when the trust fund is at $250 million or more for an entire quarter. If it exceeds $275 million or more for an entire quarter, you get a full point reduction. And then if it's over $300 million or more, which we were for all of 2019, then you get that full 1.5% reduction. So someone that was, say, a new employer coming in at 2.7%, which is the new employer rate, they previously would have got knocked down to 1.2 because that 1.5 reduction. Right now, in this current quarter, the reduction is 1%. So, and that has nothing to do with COVID. The trust fund was forecast to fall below 300 million prior to the COVID pandemic. So we were previously forecasting, going back, I would say well over a year ago, that employers would be getting a 1% reduction for this present quarter. However, I don't see how the fund stays above 250 million for the remaining portion of this quarter. And if it does fall below 250 million, there will be no reduction applied to your rate. And then once you're below 250 million, you can almost think of it as being in neutral. Once you fall below 150 million, you then get a surcharge of a 0.5 point added to your rate. And then there is a discretionary surcharge that's not tied to a particular balance of the trust fund, that is at the commissioner's discretion based upon solvency concerns with the fund, that can be added. So employers could get a full point added to their rate, but I don't see how there's going to be a reduction for the third quarter this year. So right now, second quarter, you're going to get that full point once you come to the end of July, and you got to file those reports. But for the third quarter, you're probably going to be at your earned rate without any reduction, and hopefully without any surcharge added on.
Thank you. Okay, that was the end of the pre-submitted questions we have. I understand we have about 8 questions that were submitted to Megan, which is great. I want to let everyone know that if the question requires clarification, if Megan denotes that, I have allowed folks to unmute themselves. Unmute yourself while you're speaking and go ahead and mute yourself after, just so that things are nice and clean there. And Megan, let's just start off with the questions. Oh, you've got to unmute yourself, Megan, it sounds like, or I can do that. Let's see here.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. All right, so question number 1. I have an employee whose salary was reduced by half and was denied unemployment. Is there a salary threshold in which disqualifies people during this time? I was under the impression that the executive order number 5 gave everyone access to unemployment benefits.
So that's a good question. So no, neither the executive order nor the federal CARES Act provide eligibility to everybody. So under the state program, we are, and the federal program, we are required to look at your earnings while collecting. Okay, so if you're working full-time hours, which I know your example, the person is not, if you're working full-time hours, you are not eligible for unemployment, regardless of what your earnings are. If you are, you're allowed to work part-time, and still collect. However, New Hampshire has a 30% disregard. So we allow the employee to earn up to 30% of their weekly benefit amount. So if their weekly benefit amount was the maximum amount of $427, they would be allowed to earn, I think that's $128. And anything above earnings of $128 would actually reduce their benefit amount dollar for dollar. So they can earn up to $555 and still have a benefit, right? So you take what their benefit amount is and multiply that by 130%, and anything above that in earnings would eliminate their benefit, and that's required by state and federal law. And so as long as, and the key piece there is the $600 payment. So as long as someone still has eligibility for a partial payment, it could be as little as $1. So you had part-time earnings that reduced your benefit all the way down to $1. You still get the $600. However, if your part-time earnings reduce you down to $0, you do not qualify for the $600.
Next question, Megan.
Yes. A moment. All right, next question. If an employee lies on certification, since there's no request for documentation, will they ultimately be held accountable?
So we got 145,000 new applicants. The federal program under which they are certifying specifically limits us to self-certification. Obviously, if we're provided information that would suggest that that certification is inaccurate, we will be looking into that. However, we're not going to be, we're not allowed to require any further documentation regarding the reason under which they are filing. So whether that be that they were sick, had symptoms, caring for someone, caring for a dependent, direction of a healthcare provider, that we're not allowed to ask for documentation. Everything is self-certification. But if we are provided information to suggest otherwise, we will act upon that information and will investigate.
Good to know. Next question.
Thank you. Next one. If I was approved for WorkShare for my company and it started this week, when can they expect to receive their first check?
Okay, so if you got in approved this week, then as long as everybody, so you have an approved plan, all of the employees under the plan go in and have filed an initial claim to the extent that they hadn't already done that. So the employees do the initial claim, and then come this Sunday, you would then be able to file your WorkShare plan. And so your employees that are part of the WorkShare unit or units, they don't have to file their weeklies. You file their weeklies on their behalf in one WorkShare plan. It's pre-populated with all of the employees that are part of that. So you just need to fill in the amount of hours that they worked and the amount that they earned. And then that takes care of that. So they don't have to do their weekly filings. The employer does that. And then they would be in the regular payment cycle. And usually Sunday continued claims, usually they get paid on either Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on whether or not someone has selected EFT or paper check.
Great, thanks. Is there, just as a quick follow-up to that, is there any, is the WorkShare program in terms of the processing of the benefits and all that separate from the larger pool that has had a pretty big backlog in terms of getting payments out?
So it's part of the same system, and they get if they're in the approved WorkShare plan, they're going to be in payment status, right? So there's the only thing that might cause delay on those is if you have employees that have other employment with employment other than with the WorkShare employer. we need to look at those earnings to make sure that they're not exceeding what they're allowed to earn with that 30% disregard. So the earnings that they would have from the other employment could impact the amount that they get each week. So as long as they don't have other earnings, then those are going to be just included with that certified claim that gets filed by the employer, and those payments go out no later than midweek each week, as long as the plan gets put in on Sunday.
Great, thank you. And next question.
Next question, who qualifies for the extra $600? Is it based on income level?
No. So as long as you have eligibility for either state unemployment or federal unemployment, including just a partial benefit if you have part-time earnings, you qualify for the 600. So that's every single person that is eligible for a benefit. The $600 does not get prorated based upon any earnings or any other factors. It stays 600 throughout, and that right now is scheduled to go until the end of July.
Great, thanks. Next question.
Can you hear me?
There
Sorry,
we go.
sorry
Yep,
about
go
that.
ahead.
Okay, I think this one has already been addressed. If an employee certifies as impacted, but the employer disagrees, will they receive the CARES funds?
I guess it would depend on the circumstances. So it would depend on why the employer is disagreeing, so what information they're providing. Obviously, information that comes in that would suggest someone is not eligible, we would be looking at that. But again, that individual is self-certifying, and as long as they're self-certifying to a qualifying reason, they would continue to collect, again, unless we're provided information that indicated, well, you know, that person that's been certifying as having a dependent is single and that doesn't have a child, right? So then we're obviously going to look into the issues to the extent that we're provided information, but we're not allowed to actually require documentation.
Very good, thanks. Next question.
We have received the PPP loan and can pay employees that are at home for various reasons. However, the paycheck to employees in most cases is less than the enhanced UI. If an employee resigns because the enhanced UI is more, will they still receive UI?
So this is that was the exact scenario under the federal guidance, and the answer, this is when they put in that little unless clause. And so if an employee is refusing to work or does not accept an offer of employment just to collect UI, they are not eligible for UI. But if they self-certify as to meeting one of those COVID reasons under the CARES Act, then they are eligible for UI. So it can't be just that they're saying, I don't want to take that job because I'm concerned with COVID-19, or I want to collect the extra $600 and not go to work. That would not make them eligible. But if they certify that saying, yep, I have quarantining under the direction of a healthcare provider or government official, or I'm caring for a child or family member, or I have symptoms, then they're eligible.
Thank you. Next question. If an employee had quit their job in February, but is unable to find employment today because so many places are closed, are they eligible for UI?
So they would be eligible under the federal program. So ordinarily the separation where if they voluntarily quit and it wasn't a reason that is allowed for someone to still be eligible. For instance, you're allowed to voluntarily quit employment to escape domestic violence. You're allowed to voluntarily quit employment to follow a spouse if they're to go for a new job. So there are some reasons you can quit and still get UI. In this case, though, if it was a disqual, that person would not have state UI eligibility, but they would be eligible under the federal program.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I received a determination of unemployment benefits amount of only 167, not the full 427 that I anticipated with my current Schedule C, line 31 for self-employment, made for the year 2019. I submitted this with my initial claim, and I made $51,000 last year in self-employment. Why did I only get 167? Who can I submit my tax return to again to up this amount soon?
If we could get that in through Nathan directly to me. So if we have the tax return, then it could be that it hadn't been imported into the system yet, and that's why they're paying at the 167 rate. But to the extent they've documented the earnings of I think you said it was over 50,000, they'll go in at 427, and we'll actually be backdating it back to their first week of eligibility.
Great, yeah, and I'm happy to assist to get that information to you so that an individual can reach out to me by email or phone, and I'm happy to get that right to you, Rich.
All right, sounds good.
The next question says Q3 2.7 without surcharge. This must be referring to the tax rate increase that you were talking about earlier.
Q3 2.7 without surcharge. So yes. So quarter two that we're in right now, you will have a 1% reduction because the fund maintained a balance of at least $275 million throughout the first quarter of this year. So quarter three is likely to not have a reduction because the fund will likely fall below $250 million. So what that means is that the employer's earned rate will be the rate at which they pay without any reduction for an FBR.
Thank you. Next question. Instead of work share plan, does it serve the same purpose if I bring an employee back for partial hours so that they can still collect UI? The limitation there is on their, they're only allowed to earn 30% of their weekly benefit amount before it's going to start to reduce their benefits. In a work share plan, all of their work share earnings from the work share employer, none of that is counted against their benefit. So I guess you could do it, and it might, and in some cases, I guess it could work out better not doing the work share, but you could do that math. You could look at what the reduction is, that percentage reduction, and you could then look at what their weekly benefit amount is, and then they, as long as they have, if they're in work share, they get the percentage of the weekly benefit plus the 600. If they're not in work share and they're coming in at part-time hours, then they're going to take that weekly benefit. It's going to be reduced by their earnings above 30% of their benefit, and as long as they have some benefit, at least $1, they get 600. Sounds real easy, doesn't it? All right, next question. I have not looked into work share, but will that interfere with my forgiveness of the PPP where I cannot reduce payroll for each person more than 25%?
So again, I had to caveat that with I don't know what the feds are going to come out with for further guidance. I know that you never know what they're going to come out and say. There's nothing in the PPP program or the work share program that wouldn't allow them to work together. So with PPP, you got to have 75% of the loan going to wages in order to qualify for forgiveness. The work share allows you to reduce your employees up to 50%. So anywhere from 10 to 50, and it doesn't have to be all of your employees. It can be a group no smaller than 2. So you can certainly structure your work share plan to meet that 75% loan forgiveness threshold. And the only way that you would have a problem would be that if the feds come out and say that they don't want PPP loans and work share to be able to be applied together. Again, I've seen crazy things. That would very much surprise me. I don't know why they would do something like that, but again, I can't say definitively until that guidance comes out.
Thank you. Next question. When you say someone is eligible under the federal program, but not the state program, do they get the $600 even if not eligible for the state?
Yeah, so and I understand it's confusing and talk about state program, federal program. All of them get administered through employment security. It's the same application. It's the same weekly process that people go through, regardless of whether they're accessing state or federal benefits. So as long as someone has eligibility for a partial payment under, if they're under the state program or under the federal program, they get the $600.
Great. All right, that was the last question.
Excellent. Perfect timing. Perfect timing. Great. Well, any other final thoughts, Rich, that you might have?
I do. I think I really do hope that folks are able to give Workshare a good review. I think that is going to be very helpful in terms of incentivizing employees to come back while we're still looking at $600 payments going through the end of July. So I think Workshare could be a critical tool in that. Other than that, although we would rather see something structured differently in terms of what we're able to do when someone refuses a suitable offer of employment, we really our hands are tied. I know that will frustrate business owners, but in terms of what we're allowed to do, the guidance has been clear. And as long as someone is certifying as to continuing to meet eligibility, then they get to continue to collect UI. The dollars will solve that, though. The $600, once it goes away, that will certainly cause more people to go back to work. And that's what our objective over here is. It's not, my objective is not to be paying UI. My main objective is to be able to get people back to work and have them on UI for as short a period as possible. We're dealing with an unprecedented situation, and UI needed to provide a critical lifeline for people that can't work because no one's allowing them to. So, and by paying out the $200 million that we have thus far, I think we've done a lot to help individuals. We've done a lot to help the New Hampshire economy. But when it's determined safe by public health for people to start go back to work, we want to do everything we can to encourage that, and we'll certainly be pushing for that.
Great. Again, Deputy Commissioner Richard Lavers with New Hampshire Employment Security, thank you so much for joining us, for your hard work, for your insight. I can say specifically with regard to the Workshare program, the Chamber, as well as a number of chambers around the state, thanks to one of my colleagues who introduced us to the program, is actually taking advantage of that. And it is a huge help to our organization and can be to others as well. I'm happy to anecdotally answer questions for folks to keep them at bay there, Richard. So if folks have questions that they can certainly reach out to me. It's no problem. Also want to thank the New Hampshire Chamber Executives Association. Chamber executives, whether it's a full-time exec, a part-time exec, or board members, have been working absolutely amazingly together over the last couple of months to get information to the state, get information from the state, kind of deciphering everything that's out there. And they're an amazing group of folks. And so we're thankful to be part of that. If there are additional questions, you can always send an email to the Chamber at info@littletonarea.chamber.com. You can certainly give us a call as well, but email, as you probably know, this day and age, or right now anyway, is best. We wish you all well, and again, if there are resources or information you need, or if you know someone in need of resources and information, certainly connect them with the Chamber, and we'll do our best to help them along the way.